Hey everybody, welcome to DadsDen of Pop Culture. We are in the spooky season. It's time for some spooky movie reviews. This month I'm going to be doing a quintet of werewolf movies, starting with 1935's Werewolf of London from Universal Pictures. It's a goodie. Now, as I usually do, we're going to be running through the film. We're going to be talking about the plot. We're going to be talking about some of the actors. We're going to be looking at some images from it. So there are going to be spoilers, and you may say, well, okay, this is like a 90-year-old movie, but not everybody out there has seen it. And, you know, just in case, I don't want to ruin things for them. So if you haven't seen this movie yet, and you don't want to have it spoiled for you, go watch it real quick and then come on back. The video will be there. So Carl Laemmle presents Henry Hall and Warner Oland. Henry Hall is going to be our werewolf for the evening. Warner Oland, perhaps best known for playing Charlie Chan in several Charlie Chan films. Werewolf of London. Again, we're going to talk more about the cast as their characters appear in the film. But I did want to call out the cinematographer, Charles Stumar, and Carl Hyde, I suppose that's how it's pronounced, who did the music. Now, both of them were Hungarian-born, and of course, Hungary is packed to the gills with werewolves, so this is probably an extremely accurate and realistic portrayal of the monster. Or maybe not. Now, Stumar also filmed The Mummy in 1932, and he died in a plane crash in 1935, the year this picture was released. Hyde was nominated for 2 Academy Awards. So we got some real talent in this one and some folks who know something about horror movies. Our director is Stuart Walker, who, after directing a couple dozen pictures, went into the producing business. All right. Now, they claim the story opens in Tibet. That rock formation back there looks kind of familiar. I'm not sure if we can trust these people. They might not be telling us the truth. But we do see Dr. Wilfred Glendon, played by Henry Hall, speaking to 2 Tibetan coolies as they prepare for a climb into the Himalayas. The locals aren't real big on the trip, and they flee when a man shows up riding a camel. Not because they're afraid of camels, but because he's a Catholic priest. Well, actually, because they thought he might be a demon. Now, we learn here that Glendon is a botanist, and he is here looking for a flower that takes its light only from the moon. This concerns the priest. He warns him away from searching in a valley haunted by demons. And like most scientists, Wilfred does not listen. Now, that is a big theme of horror in this period. A lot of sci-fi. Is the scientist who knows everything, except they don't really know that much. Intelligent, but a bit foolish. Okay. Well, as he and his assistant climb into the valley, Glendon's assistant feels his feet being held down so he can't walk. And then he hears the howl of a wolf. This is called foreshadowing. Glendon dismisses all of this as self-hypnosis, the basis of all superstition, and then feels a little hypnosis himself as he seems to be pushed against a rock. So he powers on alone while his assistant takes a rest. This is the point of separation. Glendon ultimately finds the flower that he's looking for, but in the process of retrieving it, he is found by something much, much worse. It's a nice use of shadow here in this sequence, but it does feel like they rush through something that could have maybe been more drawn out for tension. That sense of rushing is not uncommon from movies of this period. I don't think they quite had the pace down, of the films they were doing. Well, peekaboo, the creature attacks, and of course bites Glendon before he can fight it off with a knife. But in the end, Glendon does get his flower, and he brings it back to his laboratory in London. His arm, though, bears the scars of his attack. And by the way, this dude's lab is pretty high-tech, has a little video screen and everything for when people enter the door so he can keep track on that. Now, his visitor is his wife, Lisa, played by Valerie Hobson. She's come to collect him for the party that is happening at that moment right outside his door. Now, his lab is in a botanical garden and zoo. Or there's maybe a zoo right next door, but he promises her that after he finishes his experiment, he'll try to behave more, well, human. We're foreshadowing again. Wilfred is, again, the archetypal man of science, not overly obsessed at this point, but he has time for nothing but his work. Yeah, heck, you can even think of like Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four. It's the same basic archetype we get a lot of. He is accosted by his maiden aunt, Etty Coombs, played by Spring Byington, who chides him for neglecting his bride. Women, am I right? If they had their way, men would never get turned into werewolves. They'd never let us do anything fun. Paul Ames, Captain Paul Ames, played by Lester Matthews, then shows up, and it turns out he's an old boyfriend of Lisa's. So, this party is a mechanism to introduce the other important characters of the story, give us a little hint of their attitudes and personalities, and set up some conflicts that are going to be played out over the course of the film. It isn't terribly subtle, but it does work pretty well. For example, we spy Glendon watching his wife and her old boyfriend, and he's clearly not very happy about it. And we also learn that Paul lives in California and has a flying school there. Now, this is a neat shot from above of a plant with moving tendrils. There is a definite science fantasy element to this film beyond the horror movie aspect of it. Most werewolf films like to keep things, pretty realistic, except for the werewolf. Like, that's the one place that they go off into the supernatural. This one, dallies a little bit with weird things like this. The plant in question is from Madagascar, and it eats frogs and mice, and it's a real beauty, isn't it? Well, now we finally meet the last major player in this story, Dr. Yogami, played by Warner Oland. He converses with Wilfred, and Wilfred asks if they've ever met, and he says, yes, in Tibet, but only for a moment, and it was dark. In other words, that's why you don't recognize me. They are now formally introduced, and Yogami asks if, while Glendon was in Tibet, if he was successful in obtaining the rare flower that he was seeking, the phosphorescent wolf flower. Yogami's specimens died on his journey home. He would very much like to see Glendon's flower, which is believed to be a cure for lycanthropy. So we've set up our conflicts, an emotional triangle between Glendon and Paul Ames and his wife, and the werewolf angle is now out in the open and involves Yogami, at least seemingly. Well, naturally, Glendon scoffs at the idea of werewolves, but Yogami assures him he knows of 2 cases at that very time in London. How, Glendon asks, did they contract this? From the bite of another werewolf, and he places his hand on Glendon's arm, where he was bitten in Tibet. Okay, so he knows. Glendon continues his research and does finally make the wolf flower bloom in his sort of false moonlight that he's created. Unfortunately, something else starts to bloom in that light as well. Getting his assistant quickly out of the room, he plucks the flower and pierces the skin of his altered hand with the stem. This returns his hand to normal. So, science fiction to him is quickly becoming science fact. While this is happening, Lisa is having tea with Aunt Etty and Paul Ames, and Etty is actively trying to set these two up, perhaps to shock Wilfred out of his inattentiveness. When Yogami arrives, Etty's dog goes a little bit nuts, but calms down. She invites him to one of her parties, but he declines for being too busy. We learn here that attending the party will be the head of Scotland Yard. Maybe that's why Yogami doesn't want to attend. Now, Yogami has, though, come to warn Glendon. They must speak now, for what will happen before morning he cannot say. For tonight, there is a full moon. Glendon still doesn't believe, which frankly seems kind of unrealistic given the fact that he's just seen his hand become super hairy. But, when your worldview starts crumbling around you, a lot of people find it painful and traumatic, and they kind of try to ignore reality. Well, Yogami says that 2 buds from the wolf flower can save 2 men's lives. It is not a cure, but it is an antidote, effective for only a few hours. but Glendon will not cooperate with him, and Yogami gives up arguing, but leaves him with one last warning. The werewolf instinctively tries to destroy that thing which he loves most. Well, Wilfred then decides he better study up on this lycanthropy thing. They also use the term werewolfery, which I love that word. I think it's great. But while he's doing that, we do see a hand pluck the two blooms from the plant. Okay. Well, he finds a book on the subject, and indeed it tells the same story that Yogami does. He is then interrupted by Lisa, who is going out and about with Paul. When Glendon makes his transformation, which is coming soon, there's going to be a hint of jealousy in his mind. A good horror story should ultimately be a human story. Obsession, jealousy, regret, all good fodder for this kind of thing. Well, before Lisa leaves, he goes to her and kisses her, and there is a definite desperation in the embrace. She reacts to the kiss without emotion. Well, sitting back down in the dark, he looks at the cat, and then the cat reacts to his presence, hissing. So the transformation is beginning. And the actual transformation is very clever. He walks outside, and as he passes by these pillars that are in the foreground, he transforms a little bit more each time, more and more wolf-like. Now, obviously, this is the first time we're going to see the somewhat minimalist werewolf makeup for this film. I actually like it a lot. Apparently, it's created by Jack Pearson. Apparently, Hull did not want to be covered with too much makeup. You know, covers his face, but it's also not really the most enjoyable thing to go through. So he went for that more minimalist look. They would go full wolf when they do the Wolfman a few years later. Well, fully transformed, he goes to the lab, suggesting he still retains some human intellect, and he finds the blooms are gone. And again, this is just it's a really great look. I think it really works well because it does allow the actor to act through the makeup pretty nicely. Well, with the blooms gone, he remembers his wife leaving with Paul, and that becomes the driving impulse in his mind. We get to see a little bit of the party and an interesting and slightly tense meeting between Dr. Yogami and Colonel Forsyth, played by Lawrence Grant, of Scotland Yard. We've met somewhere? Yes. It's very tense. And then we shift to Glendon slinking through the shadows. Note he has disguised himself. So again, he's not pure animal here. He has retained a bit of his human intelligence. So that's, again, an interesting take on the werewolf. When we see the Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr., when he makes a transformation, he's an animal who walks upright, but he does not have that inkling of human intellect in him. Well, a drunk Aunt Eddie annoys Yogami on the balcony. She keeps calling him Yokohama. She notes the beauty of the moonlight, and though there have been some hints that Yogami is the other werewolf, we note that he is not changing here. Is there a reason for that? He does seem on edge, though, and very alert, like he's watching for something. A little note here, Spring Byington is really good in this movie. I enjoyed her a lot. She often played roles similar to the ones Billie Burke got of sort of, older rich women who are kind of, flaky, kind of absent-minded. But in her ramblings, Aunt Eddie says she thinks that everything is fate, and this startles Yogami. And then they hear the howl of a wolf. They head back into the party, and Eddie starts laughing uncontrollably. Too much to drink, apparently, so she's taken upstairs and put to bed. Paul helpfully opens a window to give her some air. Now, Glendon, at this point, is growing closer and closer to this house, and his howls are growing louder, and the partygoers become a bit agitated. One man says to Yogami and Forsyth that he doesn't believe it's a dog. Yogami replies, "Quite right," while Forsyth looks at the floor. Interesting. We get a really good look now at that Wolfman makeup here as Glendon moves into the room with Aunt Eddie. And I like the work of the shadow there. Now, this scene takes its time, and it ramps up the tension, and it's well shot. Again, like I said, the shadow reminds me a little bit of Hitchcock lore. the scene in his film Sabotage, 1936, in which an old woman, little boy, and a cute puppy are killed when a bomb goes off on a bus. And the secret, he said, is when you do something like that in a film, people can't trust that any character is safe. Are they about to do that to Aunt Eddie? Well, no. That's what I thought they might have been going for. But in fact, Aunt Eddie does not bite the dust here. She screams. People rush up. She says the devil was in here. She is terrified, slightly hysterical, but not hurt. Definitely a failed sanity check, though. Is the lack of violence here, though, suggestive of something? Why didn't he just attack her? Well, Aunt Eddie got away pretty unscathed, but Glendon is not through for the night. This time, he does strike. Blondes do not always have more fun. Yogami reads of the murder the next morning and seems racked with guilt and sorrow. The maid then comes in and notices two very strange-looking flowers on his desk. Aha! Now we know why he did not turn into a werewolf the night before. Well, it's time for Scotland Yard to get involved. Recall that Colonel Forsyth is the chief of police, essentially. He questions the policeman who found the body. They realize the attack happened near Eddie's, and that the woman had wounds that might have been made by a wild animal. Paul believes it must have been a wolf. Oh no, not in London. It was not a wolf. And then Paul suggests, what about a werewolf? Interesting. At the Glendon residence, Lisa tells Wilfred that Paul has suggested a moonlight ride that night. She wants, obviously, Wilfred to go. He can't do it. And talk about bad luck, though, a moonlight ride. So she's quite sad at his refusal. Things are not improved when Glendon reads the morning paper. And then his jealousy comes into it as well. He begs her to bear with him just a little while longer. He finally does agree to go on the ride that night because he has to prove his love for her. I think Werewolf of London might be a more human story than the more famous Wolfman movie. You get more character work, and I also note that Glendon's being bitten is more his own fault than it is the fault of Larry Talbot's. It makes for a very different story, but with him agreeing to go on the ride, we see him ignoring common sense out of a love for his wife, rather than out of love for his work. So is his character making a little bit of progress? Possibly. When it comes time to go that night, though, he backs out. Now, he can't tell his wife why, but of course it's because the last flower has not yet bloomed. He knows he is going to change into a werewolf, and that would be rather embarrassing to do in front of his wife and Paul. He claims he has to visit Leicester to pick up some bulbs that came in from Burma, and he forbids Lisa from riding as well. Well, she defies him, and he relents, but he wants a promise that she'll be back before the moon rises. She feels very insulted by this and will not comply, so the marriage is getting a little more tense. That night, Glendon goes to sort of a little dive, looking for a room to rent for the night. He figures he can lock himself away and therefore not hurt anybody. In conversing with the landlady, who asks if he is single, he claims he is more singular than he ever thought he would be. Now, once in the room, he locks the door, and he prays to God, don't let this happen to me again. Keep me away from Lisa. Keep me away from the thing I love. Well, alas, those prayers are not going to be answered. He does change. He bursts through the window, and off he goes in search of his wife. At the zoological gardens, a woman waits outside the gate. She's drunk and has a little snog with the guard, a married man. All the time we hear the wolves are howling, for Glendon is there. Glendon frees one of the wolves, and when the guard leaves the woman to investigate what's going on, he attacks. So there's kind of a Jekyll, Hyde, even Jack the Ripper thing going with his werewolf attacks. And you notice again, he's wearing the disguise. So he's become monstrous, but he has not become just a dumb animal. Well, the next day we see Yogami looking at the two blooms that he got. He has used them both. He's kept the curse at bay for 2 nights, but what about the third night? He needs another bloom. He decides to go to Scotland Yard. He explains to Colonel Forsyth that they met 7 years ago when he sought their resources for an unfortunate mortal infected with lycanthrophobia, as he puts it. He then tells him that the 2 murders that have already happened will be followed by 2 more, while the moon remains full, unless they realize there is a werewolf abroad in London. He says they must seize the last flower of the wolf plant, the only known specimen in London, which is in the lab of Dr. Glendon. If they do not find a way to cultivate it in London, there will be an epidemic that will ruin the city. Actually makes sense. If the werewolf starts biting people who are not killed, then they become werewolves, and then they might make more werewolves, and you only got one plant. You got to do something with it. Well, Forsyth, of course, thinks this is all nonsense, but his nephew Paul does not. Now, returning to the lab, Glendon discovers the bud has still not bloomed. His assistant suggests it can be sped up. Glendon likes this idea, but he tells the assistant, well, he must leave. He must tell nobody that he had seen him here that night. Glendon now heads for his country house. He figures maybe this is a way to get out of London. Maybe then I won't hurt anybody. He instructs the keeper that he wants to be alone and none must know that he is there. He decides to stay in a room that he can bolt. Room has bars on the windows, stone walls. He tells the keeper to lock him in and not open the door, no matter what he hears, until dawn. Guess who also decides to head out to the country house? Lisa and Paul. And they decide to park the car and walk through the woods to the house. Good thinking. And also the place they're walking through, it's where Paul proposed to her when they were kids. Oh, boy, this is like a perfect storm here. Well, Wilfred changes, and when he looks out the window, bingo, he sees them. He tears the old bars out of the window, and off he goes. When Lisa reaches the house, racing with Paul kind of as a lark, she gets her first look at her new and improved husband. And she doesn't like it. But lots of women don't like when their husbands grow facial hair. I mean, it's a thing. Well, anyways, Glendon attacks and Paul comes running. The two men struggle and Glendon is knocked out. Paul carries the fainted Lisa away to the house. Well, Paul now brings the news the next day to his uncle, Colonel Forsyth, says the monster was strangely familiar. It looked like Wilfred Glendon. Lisa and Eddie now are staying at the manor in a room, doors locked, and they promised him not to leave the room no matter what. And of course, people always follow instructions in these kinds of movies. They always do just what the doctor has ordered. So the Colonel and Paul head over to the manor, but first are informed of another murder that has occurred in London. Remember, folks, there are 2 werewolves operating and not enough flowers for both of them. But this convinces the Colonel and that Paul was wrong. So he decides to first go to the crime scene. Well, when he arrives, an inspector tells him the place smelled like a kennel. When they walked in, they discover the room belongs to Dr. Yogami, and Paul finds one of the flowers in the trash can. So off they go to Glendon Manor. We get a telephone montage. Nobody has seen or heard from Dr. Glendon. His assistant is missing. They've heard nothing of Dr. Yogami. It's actually a very efficient data dump. And then we see Glendon had been locked in a cellar in his laboratory by his assistant Hawkins. He rushes to see if the flower is blooming, and while he watches, Dr. Yogami creeps in behind him. While his back is turned, Yogami sneaks in and snips the flower. Now it all comes out. It was Yogami, of course, who bit Glendon in Tibet. The 2 men take to fighting after Yogami has given himself the antidote. Well, that was kind of a problem for him. Well, unfortunately for Yogami, Glendon wolfs out during the battle, and he kills his rival in the struggle. Now Glendon goes after his wife. They call the police, but of course Paul and the Colonel are already on the way to Glendon Manor. The women flee, with Glendon stalking them, but before he can find them, Paul arrives, honks his horn, drawing Glendon away. Creeps outside, leaps on Paul and subdues him, and then sees Lisa looking at him through the window. He creeps closer and closer, snarling as he goes. Lisa backs away, trying to reason with him, trying to get through to him. She cries his name, and then a shot rings out, hitting him in the back. Wilfred falls. Thanks for the bullet. It was the only way. He tells Lisa goodbye, tells her he's sorry, and then he passes on. And dying, he turns back into the man he was. When I file my report, I shall say he was shot by accident while he was trying to protect his wife. It ends with Lisa apparently flying to California to start a new life with Paul. The end. So, what do we think of this one? Well, I like that it's a different story than we get in some of the later werewolf stuff that we'll see. There's some interesting twists on it, and we don't get some of the typical werewolf mythology, silver bullets, things of that nature. I like that it is primarily a human story about a man who has kind of become obsessed with this goal of finding this flower and propagating it, but really not for any particular reason other than the fact that it's rare. It would be sort of a coup for a botanist to manage to do this. But in being so driven, he first exposes himself to the danger of the valley haunted by demons. Of course, being a scientist, he doesn't believe in all that stuff. Okay, so that scientific attitude of his, that arrogance, is what puts him in danger and in fact gets him infected. But we see a transformation of him over the course of the movie, of him kind of realizing he's screwed up, that his wife is much more important to him than all of this work. I think it's interesting having the other werewolf in the film, and that sort of, who's going to get the antidote first. Keep in mind, it's still not enough for both of them. They still need to try to propagate the thing. But I like it. I liked Werewolf of London. I enjoy the makeup they used on whole. Again, some people prefer the Wolfman makeup. That's, a lot heavier. And I do think it's really cool, but I like the minimalist approach. I think it works. And I think it works well, given that that when Henry Hall is the werewolf, he still is somewhat human and needs to act through it in a way that Lon Chaney Jr. didn't need to act through his makeup when he was in the Wolfman form. So 2 thumbs up for me for Werewolf of London, the first of the werewolf movies that I'm going to be reviewing this October. I am also going to do the Wolfman. We're going to look at Cry of the Werewolf. We're going to look at She-Wolf of London. And we're going to wrap it up at the end of the month with I Was a Teenage Werewolf. That's the plan for October 2025. So I hope I'll see you back for some of these other reviews. But in the end, I think this is actually very good. Most of the performances are quite good in it. Good plot. The story works. I think it holds together pretty well for the most part. And it's an interesting take on the werewolf lore when the werewolf lore had not really been, say, set in stone. Of course, there's always little variations, but there's a point where we all know how the werewolf thing works. We didn't know it yet at this point. I think they did a good job with it. Let me know what you think in the comments of this film. Do you like it? Do you hate it? Is it one of your favorites? Throw it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, please like, maybe subscribe, maybe share with a friend. That would be very cool. But until next time, God bless everybody. Please be kind to one another. Have a little bit of fun out there. Watch some good werewolf movies this spooky season. And I will hopefully see you again soon in Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Bye-bye.